Now the fourth, or the variable, that I looked at, I searched for, I waited for, because this was going to be the linchpin, and I knew it. And they kept telling me about this scale and mom and daddy scale and who in the house scale and socioeconomic. And I said, no, that's not what this scale's got to be about. But it's interesting how things come to you, because I knew that it would have to come from these young men. And so I would meet with them and kept hearing this over and over again. Well, you know, they diss me. You know, that's what happens when you diss a brother. Well, the reason why that brother went down like that is because he was dissed. Meaning what? Disrespected. And I heard it, both groups, all 200. It would happen so much. I said, okay, I've got to look at the relationship of respect to violence. So I immediately went back to my committee and I said, I need to find a respect scale. And I searched the literature and there wasn't one. And so my committee said, oh, it seems you have a problem. I said, but I must write one then. Well, they say, I'm not one of those people that create scales. I have no skill in that. It's never been tested. It's never been measured. It's never been, none of that. But they couldn't argue because one didn't exist. So I wrote the scale, and they didn't know if it was going to perform, meaning that it was valid. They didn't know it had face validity, but they weren't certain. But I looked at respect in these categories: respect among peers, respect among institutions, and respect among authority and society. I wanted to know what these young men felt about, and my hypothesis was the degree to which they felt respected, they would have less violence, and the degree to which they felt disrespected, conversely, would produce violence.
Dr. Joy Degruy begins this portion of her lecture by explaining how vacant esteem, a key component of post-traumatic slave syndrome, shapes how many black youth interpret, respect, and disrespect. Because they were conditioned in an environment where their humanity was historically devalued, disrespect takes on a heightened psychological meaning. Degruy explains that for some young black men, disrespect is not seen as a minor social slight, but as a direct attack on their worth and identity. In this context, violence becomes a learned response, not simply out of aggression, but as an attempt to reclaim dignity and assert value in a world that has consistently denied it. She emphasizes that to understand this dynamic, one must examine the environment and culture that produced these young men. Degruy's research led her to look beyond individual choices and instead focus on the conditions surrounding them. She found that many of these young men were raised in environments shaped by generations of trauma, systematic neglect, and internalized self-hate. Within these spaces, respect becomes a form of social currency, and maintaining it can feel essential for survival. As a result, even small acts perceived as disrespectful can escalate quickly because the stakes feel tied to one's very existence and identity.
Linear regression analysis, meaning I took all of those variables and I looked at them as it related to significant prediction of use of violence. And all of the hypothesis was correct. Well, great. That was wonderful. Now we know that more patient and witnessing produces violence, more urban hassles produces violence, more racial socialization decreases violence, less respect, more violence, more respect, less violence. So it became very clear, great. But then I wanted to know from these young men, two open-ended questions. So now we're not looking at a scale. I'm letting them write it out themselves, all 200 of them. If for some reason you or your friends have been disrespected, why do you think it happened? And why do you think people like you might be disrespected? I asked them this in 2000. I wanted to know, what do you think about that? And so they gave me answers. But before they gave me answers, I did a stepwise multiple regression analysis, and I wanted to look at what are the very strongest predictors of violence in this study, Joy. Of all the variables, what are the strongest? And what fell out first was victimization and witnessing, baseline variables we already knew, and respect. Strongest predictor of violence. I'm going, oh my God. And what is the criminal justice system based on? What is its model? It's punitive. I'm going to take you. So in effect, it is a wrong approach to rehabilitation because you are creating a criminal. Because the more you disrespect him and crush him, the more violent he will become. So now I go back to why, though, do you think in 2000 and 2001, and let me help you understand who the other 100 young men were, the ones that were not incarcerated. They were in a Gentleman's Rites of Passage program, Afrocentric program called Bridge Builders, where they went into Passage at 14 and they graduated from Passage after completing 1 year of college. They were going to Stanford, they were going to Harvard, they were going to black colleges, they were going all over the country. Same kids, same zip code area. Only difference was they went through this program of Passage. So surely they would have a different perspective on this. Surely they would be different in their belief system around why they were disrespected. And guess what they said? The large majority of them said, it is because I am black. I am a black man living in a white man's world, because historically we have never been respected. Post-traumatic slave syndrome, you will always be black. So how long do our black men think they're going to be disrespected? And you know they're mad about it. They're mad about it. So it became very, very clear that this wasn't any isolated incident. They knew why they were disrespected. And they knew that it was perpetual. And what does it look like? What kind of future do you have when you know you are always going to be marginalized? No matter what degree you get, no matter how much money you have. Like Stevie said, you can't, trade in your face. You can't. And one of the things that I started to realize, I said, my God, that wasn't the deep about this research, because it became very clear. Now all of the prisons, everybody's calling you, writing, because now they know it's out. I need to replicate the study. We need more research. It's not enough research. I need to look at women and girls and our relationship between men and women. I need to look at all of that. And I can't do it all. But now the cat's out. Now we know. And we know creating criminals, and you're doing it deliberately. We know it. They're not functional outside of prisons now. They're not functional. They're learning dysfunction and deviance. It's designed that way. And it is counterindicated for them to be treated with a punitive model. Clearly, it's wrong. But what was more important to me, what was far more important to me, was what I learned respect meant. That is what, to me, was the crucible in this research. Something it's called unexpected results. By the way, I discovered that they always talk about the absence of father and what it produces in young, delinquent males. My research suggested that it was the absence of mother, not the absence of father. Now, you've heard a lot of stuff, but the absence of mother, whether she was physically there or not, present, or whether she was not there, it produced more violence than the absence of father. So we need to start taking a look at that. But aside from that, here's what I realized. Can anybody out there tell me what respect means? I mean, because I asked white people what respect means. And white people, particularly white men, it was very interesting, their response. And their response was thoughtful. And they said, I think for me, respect means an earned regard. Earned regard. I asked black men and women what respect means to them. They say a sense of value and worth. Respect. To be treated with a sense of dignity, value, and worth. I asked my husband when my grandson was born, I said, does Nasir have worth? And he says, of course he has worth. I said, what is his worth? He said, hope. He is the proof. He is a continuation. He is a future. He has intrinsic worth. But what was interesting is that respect doesn't mean that. Respect doesn't either of those things. Respect, taken from the Latin, literally means look again. Respect, look again. What did they say to me in Africa? I see you. Look again. Don't look the first time. Don't trust what you see the first time. Give me a chance and look again, because then you'll see what's in you is in me. Look again. So not only must they look again, we must look again. We must respect. It is simple, and it took me all the way back to We've got to respect who we are. We cannot do that if we don't who we are. We cannot correct what we don't understand. And we cannot apologize for having the courage to talk about what hurts us. We have never been given permission, nor have we given ourselves permission to talk about our injury. Post-traumatic slave syndrome is not something odd. Naeem Akbar talked about it. James B. Comer talked about it. Asa Hilliard talked about it. Wade Nobles talked about it. Your grandmama talked about it. Your grandfather talked about it. Your sister talks about it. We just put a name to it. But there are things that go off. We've got to stop injuring ourselves, and we have to start looking more closely at that injury, something we have never given ourselves permission to do. We have a Holocaust that we have never honored. And I'm telling you, when I say everything in the dark is coming to the light, I'm telling you, our ancestors unearthed themselves here in New York. They unearthed themselves. They said, you will have to honor me. There's no choice. Everything is getting uncovered. And it's not an easy thing. This is a painful process. Nor am I looking for the permission of white people to talk about it. I'm not. I'm not asking them. To do so is to engage in post-traumatic slave syndrome. To do so, to say, Mr. Jimmy, you know, I'm cut over here. I'm cut over here. I want to show it to you. It hurts and I'm bleeding. Mr. Jimmy, does it hurt? And we will ask Mr. Jimmy, and if he says it doesn't, we go, well, if Mr. Jimmy said it don't hurt, it must not hurt. I'm not getting ready to ask anybody about my injury. I'm not getting ready to ask anyone to validate, accept, or approve of that. But I understand we need to look at this thing systematically and in the right way. In every way. We need our own truth and reconciliation. Are you with me? We need to be able to speak our injury. We need to be able to do that cathartic step. And then we need to move on to the next step, which is healing. Folks have asked me, what do I hope for? I hope for truth and reconciliation. I hope for our economic self-sufficiency. I hope for the stability of our families. I hope for the joy and happiness of our children. I hope that we will forever be contributors to an ever-advancing civilization, because we are the mothers and fathers of civilization. And so it is that time for us. So I want to close with a wonderful statement that I often read, because it is so powerful. I said to myself when my grandson was born, I had the opportunity to be at that birth. And I thought before my grandson was born that I could retire. And when I looked at him and I gazed into his eyes, all the rest of the world became ashes. Became ashes. And I said, I have to do it for him and for little Naya, my granddaughter. I have to do it for them. Because if we do it, it's going to get done. If we don't do it, it won't be done. And we will continue to be injured and to wonder what's wrong. We know what's wrong, friends. We have to begin to address it. Among the most accomplished and fabled tribes of Africa, no tribe was considered to have warriors more fearsome or more intelligent than the mighty Maasai. It is perhaps surprising then to learn the traditional greeting that passed between Maasai warriors. Kasarian and Gera, one would always say to another, meaning, and how are the children? It is still the traditional greeting among the Maasai, acknowledging the high value that they place on their children's well-being. Even warriors with no children of their own would always give the traditional answer, all the children are well. Yes, all the children are well. Meaning, of course, that peace and safety prevail, that the priorities of protecting the young, the powerless are in place, that Maasai society has not forgotten its reason for being, its proper functions and responsibility. All the children are well means that life is good. It means that the daily struggles of existence, even among a poor people, do not preclude their proper care for their young. I wonder how it might affect our consciousness of our own children's welfare if in our culture we took to greeting each other with this same daily question. And how are the children? I wonder if we heard that question and passed it along to each other a dozen times a day, if it would begin to make a difference in the reality of how children are thought of or cared for in this country. I wonder if every adult among us, parent and non-parent alike, felt an equal weight for the daily care and protection of the children. I wonder if we could say without any hesitation, the children are well. Yes, all the children are well. Our children are not well. They are not. And I strongly believe that they can be healed. They can be prevented from carrying all of the baggage, all of the injuries that I have, the injuries that I carried that my mother had and my father had and your mother and father had. I believe that if we really stand together, if we exemplify the things we know to be true and real, the things that Dr. King gave his life for, I think we can be certain that we can say, all the children are well. Dear friends, let the healing begin.
Through her research, Degruy identified victimization, witnessing violence, and respect as the strongest predictors of violent behavior. Many of the young men she studied had not only been victims of violence themselves, but had also grown up witnessing violence regularly in their homes and communities. This constant exposure normalized violence as a legitimate response to conflict. Degruy makes it clear that these behaviors do not emerge in a vacuum. They were shaped by historical trauma and reinforced by present-day conditions that fail to provide safety, healing, or opportunity. She also argues that the so-called justice system often reinforces these harmful patterns rather than correcting them. Instead of addressing the root causes of trauma and violence, the system frequently criminalizes the symptoms. Heavy policing, incarceration, and punitive responses can deepen feelings of worthlessness, anger, and alienation. In this way, the system perpetuates the very behaviors it claims to prevent, creating a cycle where trauma produces violence and punishment reinforces trauma. Finally, Degruy highlights a profound awareness among the young men she studied. Many of them clearly understood their position within the system of white supremacy. They expressed that they expected to be disrespected simply because they were black. This awareness shaped their worldview, their sense of identity, and their expectations for the future. At the same time, Degruy emphasizes that when young black men are born into and raised in environments designed to empower, affirm, and value them, their outcomes improve dramatically. Her conclusion underscores a central theme of her work. Violence is not an inherent trait, but a predictable response of trauma, and healing requires transforming the environments that shape identity, esteem, and possibility.